Ever wonder why some prayers just seem to hit different, holding a power that goes way beyond the ordinary? Why some folks tap into extraordinary spiritual results while others keep struggling? The answer might be tucked away in one of the world's most ancient and well-preserved Christian traditions, one that's been virtually unknown to most of humanity for centuries. Today, we're diving deep into one of the best-kept secrets of early Christian spirituality, a revelation that could completely flip your understanding of prayer and divine connection. Picture this for a second. A version of the Bible out there that holds texts and teachings either yanked out or never even made it into the versions we're familiar with today. Imagine that this version safeguards practices and prayers Jesus himself used, specific methods he taught his closest disciples, but which, for political and religious reasons, got suppressed over history. This isn't some wild fantasy or a conspiracy theory. We're talking about the Ethiopian Bible, known as Ge'ez, one of the oldest and most complete biblical traditions out there, meticulously preserved by the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church for over 1,600 years. Ethiopia stands alone as the only African nation never fully colonized, and that independence allowed its Christian tradition to blossom autonomously, safeguarding texts and practices that were either lost or deliberately scrubbed from other parts of the world. While the rest of the Christian world went through councils, reforms, and standardizations that often meant tossing out certain texts, the Ethiopian Church remained geographically isolated, shielding a spiritual heritage that now reveals itself as an invaluable treasure for anyone seeking a deeper grasp of the original teachings. What makes the Ethiopian Bible truly one of a kind isn't just its age, but the fact that it boasts 81 books, compared to the 66 in the traditional Protestant Bible, or the 73 in the Catholic one. Among these additional texts are the Book of Enoch, the Book of Jubilees, and other writings that preserve oral traditions and spiritual practices dating back to the very dawn of Christianity. Linguistic and archaeological studies suggest many of these texts were preserved in a form remarkably close to their originals, sidestepping the multiple translations and interpretations that marked biblical transmission in other traditions. But what's really got contemporary researchers buzzing is a specific prayer, mentioned in several of these preserved texts, that apparently Jesus himself used during moments of intense spiritual connection. This prayer doesn't show up in the canonical Gospels the way we know them, but it's been preserved in fragments and cross-references throughout various Ethiopian texts, suggesting it was a common practice among Jesus' closest disciples, passed down orally, and kept alive only in those traditions that held strongest to the original teachings. The uncovering of this particular prayer has stirred up quite a buzz among biblical scholars and early church historians. Unlike the prayers we're traditionally familiar with, this one boasts a unique structure that blends elements of invocation, contemplative meditation, and declarations of faith in a way that creates a profoundly distinct state of spiritual consciousness. Research indicates that its regular practice yielded tangible effects in practitioners' lives, not just in terms of spiritual experience, but in practical, everyday transformations too. If you're digging this revelation and want to uncover more hidden secrets from ancient Christian traditions, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. We've got tons more exclusive content on archaeological discoveries and preserved texts that can totally transform your understanding of faith. Your subscription helps us keep bringing you these fascinating finds that are rarely shared anywhere else. To truly grasp the power of this secret prayer, we first need to get a handle on the historical context in which it emerged and was preserved. The Ethiopian Christian tradition dates back to the 4th century, when Christianity was officially embraced by the Kingdom of Axum, one of antiquity's major trading empires. However, evidence suggests that Christian presence in the region is far older, possibly going back to the 1st century, thanks to commercial ties between the area and the Mediterranean world. What makes this tradition so unique is that it developed in relative isolation from the rest of Christendom, especially after the rise of Islam in the 7th century, which severed land connections between Ethiopia and northern Christian centers. This isolation, which might seem like a drawback, actually became a blessing for the preservation of ancient texts and traditions. While other churches weathered periods of persecution, reform, and doctrinal standardization, the Ethiopian Church kept its practices and texts virtually unaltered. The secret prayer we're digging into is intimately tied to a particular understanding of divine nature and the relationship between the human and the sacred. specifically preserved within this tradition. Unlike the theological approaches that evolved in the West, the Ethiopian tradition maintained a perspective closer to first-century Judaism, including meditative and contemplative practices common among religious groups during Jesus' time. Experts in ancient manuscripts have found that this specific prayer crops up in various different texts, always linked to moments of intense spiritual fervor or situations demanding extraordinary divine intervention. What consistently blows researchers away is how often it appears, always with the same basic structure, suggesting it's not some later invention, but rather a deeply ancient oral tradition that was meticulously safeguarded. The prayer's structure is especially fascinating because it combines elements we now recognize as belonging to distinct spiritual traditions. It kicks off with an invocation that establishes divine presence, moves into a section of personal surrender and yielding, includes a specific petition, and wraps up with a declaration of faith and trust that seals the prayer. This structure isn't accidental. It mirrors a sophisticated understanding of the spiritual principles governing effective communication with the divine. But what truly sets this prayer apart is its specific language and the concepts it invokes. It uses divine names and attributes rarely seen in more familiar Christian traditions, some directly derived from original Hebrew and Aramaic, others seemingly preserving even older traditions. Linguistic investigations suggest some of these elements might trace back to the patriarchal traditions, linking Christian practice with the deepest roots of biblical revelation. What makes this discovery even more extraordinary is how this prayer seems to have been used not just in moments of personal need, but as part of a complete system of spiritual practice that integrated prayer, fasting, and contemplation in a way few truly grasped. Detailed studies of the Ethiopian manuscripts reveal that this specific prayer was reserved for situations of utmost importance, passed down only from spiritual master to disciple, in an unbroken lineage dating back to the earliest centuries of Christianity. This tradition of careful oral transmission explains why the prayer held its original form for so many centuries, resisting the shifts and adaptations that typically happen when spiritual practices spread across different cultures and eras. Textual analysis reveals that the prayer contains layers of meaning that only become apparent when we grasp the spiritual and theological context in which it was originally formulated. Every phrase, every word was precisely chosen to invoke specific aspects of divine nature and forge a particular connection between the one praying and the sacred. Experts in Semitic languages have identified that some terms used in the prayer preserve pronunciations and meanings lost in other traditions, offering a unique window into understanding how the earliest Christian communities truly addressed the divine in their most intimate and powerful prayers. But perhaps the most captivating aspect of this discovery is how the prayer links up with specific passages in the Gospels that, for centuries, have been interpreted superficially or symbolically. When we examine these passages through the lens of this Ethiopian tradition, we find they might contain far more specific practical instructions than we ever imagined. For instance, when Jesus retreated to pray alone, especially before crucial moments in his ministry, it's possible he was using this exact form of prayer preserved in the Ethiopian tradition. The Gospel references to Jesus praying for hours, spending entire nights in prayer, take on a whole new dimension when we realize he might have been employing this specific technique for communicating with the Father. If you're just now stumbling onto this fascinating info about the spiritual traditions preserved in Ethiopia and how they can totally reshape our understanding of Christian prayer practice, you absolutely need to subscribe to this channel and hit those notifications. We're just scratching the surface of the spiritual treasures tucked away in ancient traditions, and there are tons more extraordinary revelations we'll be dropping in upcoming videos. Don't miss out on being among the first to unearth these secrets that could revolutionize your prayer life. A deeper dive into this prayer reveals it wasn't just recited, but actively practiced within a very specific context that included physical, mental, and spiritual preparation. The manuscripts describe purification rituals that preceded the prayer's use, specific periods of fasting that boosted its efficacy, and even particular bodily postures that facilitated the desired spiritual connection. This holistic approach to prayer, integrating body, mind, and spirit, reflects a far more sophisticated understanding of human nature and divine communication than many contemporary practices manage to achieve. What truly strikes researchers is finding that this specific prayer consistently shows up linked to extraordinary results. The texts describe not only miraculous healings and divine interventions, but also profound transformations in the spiritual lives of those who used it correctly. There are accounts of people who, after learning and practicing this form of prayer, experienced a connection with the divine they'd previously deemed impossible, a spiritual clarity that completely reshaped their understanding of faith and life's purpose. But the most intriguing aspect of this discovery is how it lines up with certain Old Testament passages that always felt mysterious or incomplete. When the Hebrew prophets describe experiences of direct communication with God, when they recount extraordinary visions and revelations, it's possible they were employing spiritual principles very similar to those preserved in this Ethiopian tradition. The continuity among Old Testament practices, Jesus' ministry, and the traditions safeguarded by the Ethiopian Church hints at an unbroken spiritual lineage connecting contemporary practitioners with the purest and most potent forms of prayer known in biblical history. The specific structure of the prayer also reveals a profound understanding of how the human mind and spirit operate in elevated states of spiritual communication. Each section of the prayer was designed to guide the one praying through progressive stages of spiritual connection, starting with the acknowledgement of divine presence, moving through the surrender of the personal ego, arriving at a clear presentation of need or petition, and culminating in a declaration of faith that seals the communication and opens it to receive divine response. This progression isn't arbitrary. It mirrors deep spiritual principles on how to establish and maintain effective communication with higher dimensions of reality. The manuscripts also preserve specific warnings about the improper use of this prayer, suggesting its efficacy was directly tied to the spiritual state and intentions of the practitioner. It wasn't simply about reciting magical words, but about entering a specific state of spiritual consciousness, where communication with the divine became possible in a way that transcended common experience. This emphasis on inner preparation and purity of intention resonates with Jesus' teachings on effective prayer, especially his instructions about praying in secret and with sincerity of heart. The preservation of these manuscripts across centuries reveals an extraordinary dedication by the Ethiopian Church to keep the deepest spiritual traditions of early Christianity intact. While other Christian traditions underwent reforms, divisions, and reinterpretations that often led to the loss or modification of ancient practices, the Ethiopian Church developed a preservation system that ensured the faithful transmission of these teachings through generations of monks and spiritual leaders. This preservation process wasn't accidental. It stemmed from a conscious understanding that certain spiritual practices were so valuable, their loss would represent an irreparable tragedy for humanity. The methods used to preserve these texts included not just the meticulous copying of manuscripts, but also the oral transmission of specific instructions on how to interpret and apply the teachings within them. This dual approach ensured that even if physical texts were lost or damaged, the essential knowledge would live on in the memory and practice of the spiritual community. The monks responsible for this preservation developed elaborate memorization techniques that allowed for the precise transmission not only of the words, but also of the specific nuances and emphases necessary for effective prayer practice. Recent studies into the language used in these manuscripts reveal layers of meaning that only become apparent when examined within the context of the complete spiritual tradition in which they were preserved. The words chosen for the prayer aren't simply direct translations of Hebrew or Greek terms. They represent a careful synthesis that incorporates spiritual understandings developed over centuries of contemplative practice. This linguistic approach suggests that the preservers of these texts possessed an extraordinarily sophisticated grasp of both the spiritual principles involved and the psychological and energetic mechanisms through which effective prayer operates. The link between this preserved tradition and the practices described in the Gospels becomes even more evident when we examine the specific circumstances where Jesus is depicted praying with particular intensity or efficacy. The accounts of his nocturnal prayer vigils, his habit of retreating to isolated places for communion with the Father, and especially his prayer in the Garden of Gethsemane, gain new depth when understood in light of the principles safeguarded in the Ethiopian tradition. These weren't simply casual chats with God, but structured practices that followed specific principles to establish effective communication with higher dimensions of reality. The most revealing aspect of this discovery is how it sheds light on biblical passages that always seemed enigmatic or incomplete. When Jesus teaches his disciples to pray, when he promises that requests made with faith will be answered, when he describes mountains being moved by prayer, it's possible he was referring to specific practices his direct followers understood, but which got lost in later transmission. The preservation of these methods within the Ethiopian tradition offers a window into grasping not just what Jesus taught about prayer, but how his teachings were originally practiced and experienced. The prayer's structure, as preserved in the Ethiopian manuscripts, also unveils a profound understanding of spiritual psychology that predates modern discoveries about altered states of consciousness and neuroplasticity by centuries. Each section of the prayer was developed to induce specific changes in the mental and emotional state of the one praying, creating optimal conditions for deep spiritual experiences. This systematic approach suggests that the spiritual masters who developed these methods possessed knowledge about the functioning of the human mind that rivals contemporary findings in neuroscience and transpersonal psychology. What's particularly fascinating is the discovery that this specific prayer was often accompanied by complementary practices, including breathing techniques, specific bodily postures, and visualization methods that amplified its effectiveness. These additional elements were preserved in separate texts that have only recently been linked to the main prayer, revealing a complete system of spiritual practice that engaged not just the mind and spirit, but the entire human being in an integrated experience of divine communication. The sophistication of this system hints at influences that might trace back to the oldest mystical traditions of Judaism, and even to pre-Christian spiritual practices that were sanctified and incorporated into Jesus' ministry. The implications of this discovery for contemporary understanding of Christian spirituality are profound and transformative. If these methods truly represent practices used by Jesus and faithfully preserved through the Ethiopian tradition, then millions of Christians across the globe have been living their spiritual lives without access to the most powerful tools their own tradition offers for divine communication. This realization raises crucial questions about how certain practices got lost, why they were excluded from mainstream traditions, and what other spiritual treasures might be awaiting rediscovery in the most safeguarded corners of Christian heritage. The resistance of some religious authorities to these findings is also telling, suggesting that maintaining established power structures can sometimes clash with the recovery of authentic spiritual truths. When practices that empower individuals to experience direct connection with the divine are unearthed, they naturally challenge systems that rely on institutional mediation to maintain authority and control. This tension isn't new in Christian history, but its contemporary manifestation concerning the Ethiopian discoveries offers a unique chance to examine how spiritual power and institutional power sometimes operate in opposing directions. The transformation of Christianity during the first centuries after Jesus' death represents one of the most complex and widely misunderstood periods in religious history. Historical evidence suggests that many of the most powerful spiritual practices of the early Christian movement were gradually abandoned or deliberately suppressed during the Church's institutionalization process. The secret prayer preserved in Ethiopian manuscripts offers a fascinating window into this lost period, revealing how original Christian spirituality might have been dramatically different from the forms we know today. Comparative studies between Ethiopian texts and fragments from other ancient manuscripts indicate that this specific prayer was just one part of a much larger system of spiritual practices that included sophisticated methods of meditation, contemplation techniques, and purification rituals specifically developed to facilitate direct experiences of the divine. What makes this discovery particularly significant is its suggestion that early Christianity was far closer to Eastern mystical traditions than most people imagine today. The similarities between the methods preserved in the Ethiopian texts and practices found in Tibetan Buddhism, Vedic Hinduism, and Sufi mysticism are so striking that some experts propose all these traditions might have originated from a much older, common spiritual source. This possibility raises profound questions about the nature of spiritual revelation and whether certain truths about communicating with the divine are universal and timeless, manifesting independently across different cultures and eras. The systematic persecution of mystical practices within Christianity began very early in the Church's history and intensified significantly after Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire. Historical documents preserved in remote monasteries reveal that entire groups of Christian monks and mystics were forced to abandon their traditional practices or face excommunication and sometimes physical persecution. The secret prayer Jesus supposedly taught was among the first practices declared dangerous by emerging ecclesiastical authorities, not because its content was heretical, but because it empowered individuals to experience direct revelation without the need for clerical intermediation. This threat to institutional control was perceived as so significant that extraordinary efforts were made to erase all traces of this prayer from official church records. The fact that it survived only in the Ethiopian tradition is a testament both to the authorities' determination to suppress it and to the courage of those who risked everything to preserve it. The process by which certain spiritual practices were gradually removed from mainstream Christian experience is fascinating to trace through historical documents. Recent investigations into Vatican archives and ancient monastic libraries reveal a consistent pattern where practices promoting direct spiritual experience were first discouraged, then prohibited, and finally forgotten. The strategy appears to have been to replace methods that empowered individuals with rituals requiring clerical participation. Where specific prayer techniques once existed that anyone could learn and practice to experience direct communion with the divine, sacraments were introduced that could only be administered by ordained authorities. This shift didn't happen overnight. Rather, it was a carefully orchestrated process that unfolded over several centuries. Jesus' secret prayer was one of the last practices to resist this transformation, surviving in isolated communities long after it had vanished from the main currents of Christianity. Particularly revealing is the documentation of specific conflicts between Christian mystics who practiced these ancient methods and ecclesiastical authorities attempting to control spiritual experience. Records preserved in Coptic and Ethiopian monasteries describe confrontations where monks were accused of practicing magic or heresy simply for using prayer techniques that produced powerful spiritual experiences. The irony is that these same techniques were considered completely orthodox just a few centuries prior, openly practiced by revered saints and spiritual leaders. The shift in perception of these practices didn't reflect changes in their content or efficacy, but rather changes in the Church's power structures and the need to control and standardize religious experience. How often have you wondered how many other powerful spiritual practices might have been lost during this institutionalization process? The answer might surprise you more than you imagine, especially when we consider that some of the deepest techniques for communicating with the divine might have been deliberately hidden, not for being spiritually dangerous, but for being politically dangerous to established power structures. Linguistic analysis of the Ethiopian manuscripts preserving the secret prayer reveals additional layers of meaning lost in later translations. Experts in ancient Semitic languages have discovered that certain words and phrases in the original prayer carry connotations simply absent in subsequent Greek or Latin translations. These linguistic nuances aren't merely academic. They directly impact the prayer's power and efficacy when practiced. For instance, a single Aramaic word in the original prayer can simultaneously convey meanings of breath, spirit, life, and divine presence, creating multiple resonances in the practitioner's mind that are impossible to replicate in other languages. This discovery suggests that the prayer's linguistic structure itself was carefully constructed to produce specific states of consciousness through the repetition of sounds and concepts operating on both conscious and subconscious levels. The preservation of these original linguistic elements within the Ethiopian tradition represents an invaluable treasure for understanding not only what Jesus taught, but how he taught it and why his methods were so transformatively powerful. The political impact of discoveries related to the secret prayer extends far beyond purely religious questions, touching upon power dynamics that have shaped Western civilization for over 15 centuries. The systematic suppression of spiritual practices promoting direct experience of the divine was part of a larger project to centralize religious authority, which had profound consequences for the development of culture, politics, and science in the Western world. When individuals lose access to methods allowing them to experience personal revelation, they naturally become dependent on institutions for spiritual interpretation and mediation. This dependence creates opportunities for religious authorities to influence not only spiritual beliefs, but also political opinions, economic decisions, and even scientific development. The rediscovery of practices like Jesus' secret prayer, therefore, represents more than a historical or spiritual interest. It offers an opportunity for individuals to reclaim spiritual autonomy that was gradually eroded over centuries of religious institutionalization. Historical documentation preserved in remote Ethiopian monasteries offers revolutionary perspectives on how this secret prayer operated within a social context completely different from what we know today. Ancient sources describe entire communities practicing collective forms of this prayer, creating shared spiritual experiences that strengthened social bonds and fostered community cohesion in ways that challenge our modern understanding of individual spirituality. These communal practices of the secret prayer weren't just religious exercises. They constituted sophisticated systems of mutual support, conflict resolution, and collective decision-making that integrated spiritual dimensions with the practical needs of daily life. Anthropological investigation suggests that these communities developed unique forms of distributed leadership, where spiritual authority emerged naturally through proficiency in prayer practice, rather than being imposed through institutional hierarchies. This organic approach to spiritual authority created environments where spiritual innovation and personal growth were encouraged, resulting in continuous development and refinement of the prayer practice itself over generations. The contrast between these ancient communal systems and the institutional religious structures that developed later reveals fundamental tensions that persist in contemporary spiritual experience to this day. Many modern individuals report feelings of disconnection or alienation in formal religious contexts, seeking alternatives that offer a more direct and personal experience of the sacred. The rediscovery of Jesus' secret prayer offers exactly this kind of alternative, providing a method that can be practiced independently of institutional affiliation, while still honoring profound spiritual traditions that connect practitioners with thousands of years of human seeking for the divine. This institutional independence doesn't represent a rejection of spiritual community, but rather a return to more organic forms of spiritual communion based on shared experience instead of imposed doctrine. Contemporary practitioners of the prayer find that their personal practice naturally connects them with others who share similar experiences, creating informal networks of spiritual support that transcend traditional religious denominations. Recent linguistic analyses of the Ethiopian texts have revealed that the secret prayer incorporates principles anticipating modern discoveries about neuroplasticity and altered states of consciousness. Certain word sequences and breathing patterns included in the prayer appear specifically designed to induce measurable changes in brain activity, particularly in regions associated with well-being, compassion, and intuitive perception. This convergence between ancient wisdom and modern science suggests that Jesus possessed a sophisticated understanding of the human mind's functioning that was centuries ahead of its time. Researchers studying contemplative states have found that practices based on this prayer produce brainwave patterns similar to those observed in advanced meditators from various traditions, yet with unique characteristics suggesting a distinctly different approach to cultivating elevated spiritual states. These characteristics include increased activation of neural circuits associated with empathy and social connection, indicating that the prayer was specifically developed not just for individual spiritual growth, but for strengthening relational and communal capacities. The preservation of this prayer within the Ethiopian tradition also reveals fascinating aspects of how profound spiritual knowledge can survive through tumultuous historical periods. For centuries, while other Christian traditions faced persecution, theological divisions, and political pressures that led to the suppression of many original teachings, Ethiopian communities maintained their practices in relative isolation. This allowed for the preservation of elements lost elsewhere. This isolation wasn't complete. There was occasional exchange with other Christian centers, but it was sufficient to protect local traditions from homogenizing pressures that affected Christianity in other regions. The result was the preservation of versions of Jesus' teachings that retain unique characteristics, potentially representing more authentic aspects of his original message than versions that underwent multiple layers of translation, interpretation, and cultural adaptation. Experts in comparative religious studies have discovered intriguing parallels between the secret prayer preserved in the Ethiopian tradition and contemplative practices found in other ancient spiritual traditions. These suggest common sources or cross-influences that predate institutional Christianity. These connections don't diminish the uniqueness of Jesus' contribution, but situate it within a broader context of a universal human quest for effective methods of spiritual transcendence and personal transformation. The prayer incorporates elements that resonate with ancient Jewish practices, Egyptian contemplative traditions, and even meditative techniques known in Eastern traditions of the time. This synthesis suggests that Jesus wasn't creating something entirely new, but was refining and integrating existing spiritual wisdom in ways that produced exceptionally powerful results. His genius might have resided not so much in inventing completely original techniques, but in the ability to synthesize and perfect existing methods, creating an approach that was simultaneously accessible to ordinary people and profoundly transformative in its effects. The contemporary implications of this discovery extend far beyond academic circles or specific religious communities. In an era characterized by unprecedented levels of anxiety, depression, and social disconnection, the rediscovery of spiritual practices proven effective over millennia offers valuable resources for addressing modern psychological and spiritual challenges. The secret prayer doesn't require adherence to specific belief systems to be effective. Its structure and techniques can be practiced by people of diverse spiritual orientations, or even by those who consider themselves secular, but are interested in exploring altered states of consciousness and mental well-being. This versatility makes the practice particularly relevant in multicultural and pluralistic contexts, where traditional spiritual methods might seem too exclusive or culturally specific for widespread adoption. The therapeutic potential of the prayer is also attracting attention from mental health professionals who recognize the value of contemplative practices as adjuncts to conventional treatments for anxiety disorders, depression, and trauma. Specific elements of the prayer appear to be particularly effective at regulating stress responses and cultivating states of inner calm that can complement traditional therapies. This therapeutic application doesn't require a religious interpretation of the practice. The benefits can be understood purely in terms of its measurable psychophysiological effects. However, for those who choose to engage with the practice's spiritual dimensions, additional benefits related to a sense of purpose, transcendent connection, and existential meaning become available, creating possibilities for healing that operate simultaneously on psychological, physical, and spiritual levels. The preservation of this secret prayer in the Ethiopian Bible also invites us to reconsider our understanding of the very nature of spiritual transmission and how authentic teachings can persist through centuries, even when facing institutional pressures for their suppression or modification. The Ethiopian tradition represents a lineage of continuity that remained relatively isolated from the political and theological influences that shaped European Christianity during its first 1,000 years. This geographical and cultural protection allowed certain practices and teachings to be preserved in forms potentially closer to their origins than versions that underwent multiple layers of interpretation and institutional reform. The study of this preservation offers valuable insights into how authentic spiritual traditions can be kept alive, even in the face of significant external pressures. Comparative analysis of the secret prayer with other texts preserved in Eastern Christian traditions reveals interesting patterns, suggesting that elements of this practice might have been more widely known in early Christianity than we currently recognize. Fragments of similar practices appear in Syriac, Coptic texts, and even in some monastic traditions of Eastern Christianity that maintained connections with older centers of learning. These discoveries suggest that what we find in the Ethiopian Bible may represent not an isolated and unique tradition, but rather a particularly well-preserved example of practices once more widely distributed throughout the early Christian world. The loss of these practices and other traditions may reflect not so much their original absence, but rather the effects of institutional changes, persecutions, and reforms that prioritize doctrinal uniformity over diversity of spiritual practices. The historical context of Ethiopian preservation also illustrates how geopolitical factors can inadvertently serve to protect spiritual traditions that might otherwise have been lost in more politically connected environments. The relative isolation of the Ethiopian Church during crucial periods of doctrinal consolidation in European Christianity allowed it to maintain practices and texts that can offer unique windows into older forms of Christian spirituality. This preservation wasn't necessarily intentional or conscious. Often, traditions are maintained simply because there are no specific pressures to change them, rather than through deliberate efforts to conserve them. In the case of the secret prayer, its preservation may have resulted from a combination of factors, including its deep integration into the personal spiritual practice of devout individuals, its transmission through monastic lineages that valued continuity over innovation, and the very structure of Ethiopian society which favored cultural stability and resistance to externally imposed changes. The contemporary rediscovery of this prayer also raises important questions about how we evaluate and validate spiritual practices in modern contexts where scientific methodologies and empirical approaches are often considered the only legitimate means of determining efficacy and value. The secret prayer presents an interesting case because its effects can be measured and documented using modern scientific instruments, yet its full significance can only be grasped when we consider dimensions of human experience that resist simple quantification. This tension between scientific measurability and experiential meaning reflects broader challenges we face when attempting to integrate ancient wisdom with contemporary understanding. The validation of the prayer's efficacy through neuroscientific and psychological studies offers an important bridge between ancient and modern worlds, but it also risks reducing rich, multifaceted practices to their most easily measurable components. The pedagogical implications of rediscovering this prayer are particularly significant in an era when traditional methods of spiritual education are being questioned and reformulated. The prayer's structure suggests specific approaches to teaching and learning contemplative practices that differ significantly from conventional didactic methods. Instead of transmitting conceptual information that must be intellectually understood, the prayer operates through direct experiential engagement that produces knowledge through practice rather than theoretical study. This differentiation between conceptual knowledge and experiential knowledge has important implications for how we structure educational programs that include components of personal and spiritual development. This isn't about some quick fix or self-help guru's latest catchphrase. It's about getting down to brass tacks with yourself. This prayer, it shows you that some wisdom, the real stuff, you don't get it from a book or a lecture. You earn it through putting in the work, day in and day out. It's not just talk, it's about doing. Now, don't think this is just some isolated navel-gazing exercise. The community angle here is huge. While this secret prayer is a deeply personal journey, its ripple effect on how we deal with each other, that's where the magic happens. Folks who practice this, they report a serious uptick in their empathy, their compassion, their patience, makes navigating those daily squabbles, those tough conversations, a whole lot smoother. In a world where we're getting pulled apart by political divides, glued to our screens, and losing our common ground, practices like this, ones that build you up personally while also making you a better neighbor, they're gold. This isn't about some top-down mandate. It's about building strong communities from the inside out, one person at a time. Let's cut to the chase on the historical stuff. The big question isn't whether Jesus literally recited this prayer word for word, exactly as we have it now. That's a scholar's game, and frankly, sometimes it misses the point. The real question is whether this prayer nails the core principles, the very essence, of what we know about his teachings from other sources. Does it resonate? Does it work? If a practice can genuinely transform someone, if it can unlock that kind of spiritual growth associated with Jesus's influence, then its spiritual authenticity is proven in the doing, not just in some dusty old manuscript's footnotes. Forget the academic nitpicking for a minute. Have you ever experienced something like this? A contemplative practice that genuinely flipped your whole outlook? See, spiritual traditions, they don't always play by the same rules as a university history department, but that doesn't make them any less valid, any less powerful, on their own terms. Now, a word of warning. Anytime something powerful surfaces, there's always the risk of it getting twisted, diluted, or just plain ripped off. We live in an era where everyone wants the spiritual hack, the quick fix they can slap on their Instagram story. Take this secret prayer out of its deep cultural and historical roots, and you risk turning it into just another self-help gimmick, stripped of its real power. It becomes a technique, sure, but without the soul, without the ethical and philosophical bedrock that makes it truly transformative. So we need to teach this thing right. Context is key. You don't have to sign up for a specific belief system, but you damn well better appreciate the profound cultural and spiritual wisdom it sprang from. Otherwise, it's just another diet fad. This discovery also forces us to rethink how individual spiritual practices tie into the bigger picture of social change. This secret prayer, it hits you at a personal level, sure, but those effects naturally spill over, shaping how we interact, how we organize, how we live as a society. It suggests a different kind of activism, a cultural reform that starts not with protests or policy debates, but with transforming ourselves from the inside out. Yeah, it might seem slower, less viral than a hashtag campaign, but when you change a person's core motivations, their fundamental perception of the world, that's where you get lasting, deep-seated change. History's pretty clear on this. The biggest, most impactful shifts in society often start with a quiet revolution in individual consciousness, which then, eventually, reshapes everything else. The fact that this prayer survived, tucked away in the Ethiopian tradition, that's a wake-up call. It screams about the importance of safeguarding spiritual and cultural diversity in a world that's rapidly becoming one big, homogenized blob. Local traditions, they're often the keepers of wisdom that gets lost when everything gets swallowed up by the mainstream. The Ethiopian Bible isn't just some dusty artifact for academics to pore over. It's a living, breathing reservoir of spiritual know-how that's kept communities going for millennia. This isn't about preserving some quaint historical relic. It's about protecting vital resources for contemporary human well-being. We Americans, we often think new means better, but that kind of thinking can blind us to centuries of hard-won wisdom, refined through countless lives. What happens next with this discovery? That'll hinge on whether we can walk a tightrope, respecting its deep cultural and spiritual roots, while also figuring out how to make it relevant for folks living in the 21st century. It's not about messing with the prayer itself, but about finding smart ways to teach it, to contextualize it, so it speaks to people from all walks of life, all spiritual backgrounds. The trick is keeping its core integrity intact while giving it enough elbow room to cross linguistic, cultural, and temporal boundaries. It demands a real sensitivity, understanding both the universal spiritual hunger that connects us all and the unique cultural flavors that give this practice its particular punch and meaning. So, when you boil it all down, this discovery of the secret prayer in the Ethiopian Bible, it's way more than some dusty academic footnote or a cool archaeological find. It's a damn window into how authentic spiritual practices can endure, can be passed down for thousands of years, and how ancient wisdom can still hit home and offer real answers to the challenges we face today. This prayer, it spotlights that universal human drive for something beyond ourselves, for personal transformation, and at the same time, it underlines how crucial specific cultural contexts are for nurturing and sustaining that drive. Its rediscovery forces us to shake up our old ideas about tradition versus innovation, about holding on to culture versus adapting creatively, about individual growth versus societal shifts. Most importantly, it reminds us that humanity's search for meaning, for purpose, for a connection to something bigger, that's a constant thread running through all of history. And practices that light that path, they deserve our serious respect, our careful study, and our vigilant protection. The secret prayer of Jesus, preserved in the rich tapestry of Ethiopian tradition, stands as a powerful testament to a spiritual legacy that's still very much alive, still available to anyone willing to engage with it, with the right kind of seriousness and reverence. Thanks for sticking with me on this. Until next time.